There are a few things that every podcaster should have right at the start of their podcasting journey. And we're not talking about microphones, headphones, cover art, those sort of things, although those things are obviously very important. Before worrying about any of that, there are a few things that you need to get clear on. In this episode of Podcasting Amplified, Jennifer Rosemary Francis, host of Tools of the Podcast Trade, is sharing her 3 unexpected tools that every podcaster needs to have. We cover in this episode the 3 unexpected tools for podcasters that we all need to set us on a path to success. The biggest causes of pod fading and how to avoid it. How to stop emulating your favourite podcasters and why it's so important to be yourself. The most common barriers podcasters face for not getting started and how to break through them, and much more. If you're just getting started on your podcast journey or you're having trouble getting the results that you want and feel like there might be something missing, then this episode is for you. Jen, thank you for joining me on Podcasting Amplified. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me.
That's great. So Jen, she hosts Tools of the Podcast Trade, which is a podcast where she helps clarify tricky podcasting topics for podcasters, discussing tools and strategies. And she is sometimes joined by industry experts and tool creators. So I thought it'd be a good idea for us to speak, and I'm sure she'll have some insight and we can talk about various aspects of podcasting for you. So when we talk about the tools of the podcasting trade, Jen, we're not just talking about the physical tools, are we, like microphones and things, although I know you do talk about the sort of technical stuff. What is the sort of overall theme and what are these tools that you're helping podcasters to get to grips with to help them with their podcasts?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the biggest tools for me in life, but specifically in podcasting, and this stemmed from my own experience starting my first podcast. So it's mindset. And it might seem like a strange tool in podcasting, but I feel it's the number one tool because while mentoring podcasters or aspiring podcasters, I find that they get hung up on stuff. They get hung up on the microphone. They get hung up on the how do I get it online and stuff like that. And you realize after they've asked that same question for 2 or 3 years that it has nothing to do with the questions they're asking. It has to do with what's blocking them. What is their mind telling them? And so that is my number one tool. I have 3 main ones, but that's my number one.
Let's hear the other 2.
Okay, so the second one is a mission statement. Every podcast needs a mission statement. And it's just a simple statement as to who you're podcasting for, what is your podcast name, what is the topic, and the most important part of that mission statement is why. Why are you starting a podcast or having a podcast, and why do you want to do it for your avatar, that specific audience, that specific one person, because it should be one person you're podcasting for, not 1 million downloads. This is about that person's whose need you're trying to meet. And so I think that a mission statement is the best way to capture this. It gives you a way to visualize your podcast, what the colors are, what the artwork will look like, and it gives you a vision. It probably should be reframed as a vision statement because it gives you a vision as to what your podcast should look like. But the number one reason I think a mission statement is important, it will always remind you why you started. When you get to the point where, what am I going to talk about this week? I've run out of things to do. I feel burnt out. I'm not making any money. I'm not getting enough download. Go back to that mission statement and remember why you wanted to do this in the first place. And I'll find that you'll probably find that it helps you, rethink where you are at that moment. And the third thing is mentorship. Mentorship for me means that you have somebody who could help you get through the rough times. It's not necessarily somebody hovering over you or holding your hand to get to where you need to be, but it's somebody who could get you to bridge that 2 millimeter gap. Sometimes I'll give you an example. I've had a mentor who he's in Africa and he has a podcast in Swahili on tech, and he was struggling because he had no money and he didn't know what he was going to do. And I asked him to walk down the street and see if there's a tech store or a store that his audience may visit, who and see if they'll sponsor him. 2 or 3 days later, he emailed me and said, I got a sponsor for my podcast. So that's what a mentor does. And if you allow me, I'll give one more story.
Yeah,
I met a gentleman earlier this year, and he had a podcast in 2016. He stopped recording. And I'm listening to this podcast and I'm thinking to myself, this sounds so good. His voice is good. His vision is excellent. And the content is so useful. And I said to him, what's wrong with this? Why aren't you doing this? He said, the audio didn't sound right. There was always something, but it was always the audio. If you have a mentor, if he had me as his mentor, I could have shown him what to do, point him to somebody who could help him, so many things. And it all ties into the mindset, the mission statement, and mentorship. You need to have somebody to help guide you when you hit those snags so that you don't pod fade, because we're like 90% of podcasters fade before they reach 10 episodes or something like that. It's really hard. So
wow, thank you. Yeah, no, those work really nicely. So you've got the 3 M's really, the mindset, the mission statement, and mentorship. So if you don't mind, we'll just jump back into the first one. It'd be good to just talk a little bit more about these 3 important tools, vital tools really. So the mindset, what typically do you find podcasters are communicating with you that you can sort of see behind? So you mentioned about the audio and things. Are there any other things that you can sort of tell that it's a mindset thing with the podcast, even though what they're, putting across, it might be, I can't afford this, or, maybe I'll just wait until I know that I'm going to get 100 listeners signing up or something like that. And what kind of advice do you give them just to sort of push them and get them to just start?
So I have 2 quick examples of that. One is a lady, she's an accountant, and she had an idea to start a podcast to help consumers on credit issues. And 2-3 years later, she was still fumbling with spreadsheets because spreadsheets and slide presentation, because she's an accountant, right? So her mind was that's what people wanted to see. They wanted to see the data. I had to help her understand that that's not what people are interested in. Her message was a good one and a useful one. And I don't want to divulge too much about that. But the way she was presenting it, they weren't going to absorb that. And it took her a long time to get that, because, she kept going over and over again. She needed that presentation. She needed that spreadsheet. A second person needed a co-host. That's her reason for not starting a podcast, because she needed a co-host. And she spent all this time not focusing on getting a show on the air, but on thinking, I need someone else to help me with this. And I gave her ideas of how to get somebody, but she just couldn't grasp that it really doesn't matter if you have a co-host or not. Just start the podcast, and then people will be on there with you. I even volunteered to be your co-host for one of the episodes, just so she could get that going, because it really frustrates me when I see people do that.
Yeah, I guess having a co-host it gives you that kind of crutch, someone to lean on. I mean, it's the same when running a business or anything. Like, it's difficult doing it by yourself, and there are going to be days when you want someone else to sort of take over, or having a co-host is nice for the audience and just gives them some sort of a bit of rapport, and that doesn't have to be the thing that stops you though. Like you say, she can get started and maybe find a co-host down the line.
Right.
And moving on to the mentorship side of things, so I guess it's the same kind of feeling, the need to have somebody to lean on, but maybe that doesn't have to be a co-host. Maybe it can be a mentor. And so just to touch on one of the stories you mentioned about, you suggested that the podcaster goes and asks for a sponsor, and that thankfully worked out for him. Was that just something you suggested in that particular situation, or do you recommend that? Is that kind of a general recommendation for podcasters that feel like they don't have any money to get started? Is money a big thing for podcasters?
Yes, I actually do recommend that. And if I may back up just 1 second, for the people who are stressing over a co-host, I think having a guest on your podcast is probably the next best thing, because you're using someone else's expertise to bolster yours, if that's what you need. But as far as the sponsorship is concerned, I really believe in that. I interviewed a guy named Rich Bennett a while ago, and he talked about how before he even started his podcast, he had the idea. He went around talking to people and see if they would sponsor him. And they did. So if your podcast is something that people will listen to, or it has content that will help a certain, and this is why your audience is important, because you targeting that audience is very important, because you'll know which business to approach. Right? And so it is up to you to merge those two needs, the needs of the business to want more audience, to want to connect with your audience, and you wanting to make sure your audience get access to that business, service, or products. And it's a win-win-win, right? Audience win, you win because you have money to continue. And the business win because you're talking about them on your podcast.
Yeah, cool. And that touches on the sort of mission statement as well. And that is something that when we're helping launch a podcast, that's like the first question. Like, what are you going to get out of this podcast? Or what do you want to get out of this podcast? And who are you going to be helping? Like, what pain points are you going to be solving? And that's the question to be asking first, not what microphone do I need? That sort of comes later, really.
Yeah.
Just going back to, you mentioned you had a podcast first. When did you first sort of enter the podcasting world? And could you tell us a little bit more about your journey with that first podcast?
So I started with the idea. It was not a podcast idea. I started a radio show in 2014 that I wanted to talk about the issues and challenges surrounding moms who are raising their children alone. So solo moms. And I realized that it didn't work. The platform I was choosing was online radio. And I discovered podcasting through, I think it was John Lee first, and then Pat Flynn. And I learned, and I researched, I did all the lizard brain things, right? 6 years. It was 6 years before I actually, when I went to a Tony Robbins Unleash the Power Within event. And after that 4 days of craziness, I came home and I just hit publish. I just said, okay, we're doing this. And those 6 years they weren't wasted years for me, but I think they were wasted years for my audience. And that's something to think about.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like something worth thinking for those having those mindset. Like, maybe not if you don't feel like it's wasting your time, or maybe it's not just wasting your time, but are you wasting your audience time by sort of withholding what you can offer them? Mm-hmm. Why do you think that so many podcasters are pod fading? Do you think it's just these three things that, they're not getting support, they don't have a clear mission statement and their mindset, or do you think there's anything else that's causing people to give up, basically?
I think those are the three main things from what I am seeing and from my own personal experience. But one of the other thing is that I detect that, and I was guilty of this for a while, I detect that new podcasters are trying to emulate experienced podcasters or successful podcasters. I used to hear a lot, I want to be just like Joe Rogan. Well, you cannot be Joe Rogan. You have a message, and that message is specific to your audience. Number one. Number two is that we listen to the naysayers. Oh, you have to have 10,000 download or 1,000 download or whatever the metrics is. And we fail to focus on the needs of our audience, right? Pat Flynn says, if you think 100 download or 100 people on your email list is not a lot, put all those people in a room, right? And you'll change your perspective on that. So I've learned not to think about, I think about the numbers in the terms of how I'm going to serve my audience, but I stop letting it give me brain freeze. Because when you see what other people are doing, you can get brain freeze and think, I don't know how I'm going to do it like that. But you don't have to do it like that. You have to do it the way you're doing it to please your audience. And that's why I say, as big as the podcasting world is, there is no competition in podcasting, right? You could have two hairdressers starting a podcast and they have totally different focus, totally different audience, and totally different message.
Yeah.
Right? So that's my take on that.
Yeah, and I think people don't realize that how early podcasting is. Like, they'll look at everyone's starting a podcast, and yes, there are sort of over 4 million podcasts around, but you know how many, if there were only 4 million YouTube channels available right now, then you'd be thinking, oh my god, I've got to get on that, just because people know how big YouTube has become now. But it's kind of still early in the podcast world. You mentioned about podcasters trying to emulate other podcasters. How do you see that show up with them? Like, are there kind of tells that, or do they explicitly say they're trying to emulate another podcaster, or can you just tell that they're not being their kind of authentic selves on their podcast?
It's more in the words they say, the language they use when they're like, we're in chat groups, or we're in, in these Zoom calls. It's like, I'm not being successful because I'm not getting 10,000 downloads. I only got 200 downloads. And it's just the language I only got. Yeah. And like I said, I used to be there, but I started to see, who are those 200 people downloading my podcast? And which episodes are they downloading? Because I want to know. And those are the things, if we bury ourselves in, instead of the low pod esteem, if you will, that we will be more successful, because you have to define success for yourself. I think using social media to define your podcasting success is wrong. It's really wrong, given what it is. And, people are listening to podcasts. I think we had a 450% increase in podcast listenership since in the last 2 or 3 years. 200 million Americans listen to podcasts. And that's where people go when they want information. Yes, sometimes they go to YouTube because they want to watch a video. But if you're driving a car, you're not watching a video. And if you're at work, you're not watching a video. You're listening. You have your headphones in if you're allowed at work, and you're listening. And that's why podcasts are popular. So I want to ask podcasters, new or, existing, to remember your audience, focus on your audience. And remember, people want to know what you have to share. And you have the perfect platform to let them hear it wherever they are. Mom doing the dishes, washing clothes, can tell Alexa, turn on Tools of the Podcast Trade, episode whatever. You understand? So it's you can see my excitement. I just love this space because it levels the playing field for us.
Yeah, love that excitement. It's a very unique medium. It's also a very open medium. Like you say, it levels the playing field. It's much easier to access other mediums, and even where YouTube's concerned, even with YouTube, it's all contained within one system. You have to kind of play by their rules, whereas podcasting don't really have to play by anyone's rules, really. Yeah. And when you say about what people are saying with the analytics and stuff, that you can tell that they're trying to emulate other podcasters. I see that a lot with what the ways that people are trying to promote their podcast as well. Like certain things work for those podcasters like Joe Rogan that isn't going to work for newer podcasters. Like you can't get people to listen to your episode just because you have, you know, a certain high caliber of guest on, because you kind of need to work. You need to be a bit more strategic and around it than they do. If we get a little bit more specific about starting a podcast, so maybe for those listening who are quite early on in their journey and they haven't got everything in place yet, we've got these three things. So mission statement and mentorship. Starting with the mentorship, say somebody should start getting mentorship. Would you say like right before they even start their podcast, when they're in the planning phase, or when they start hitting hurdles?
When you're in the planning stage for your podcast, you have a lot of questions. And I think that the more research you do, the more confused you can be. You know, you sometimes don't develop clarity by doing research. And sometimes that's why some people will say, just grab your cell phone and record your first episode. Forget about learning. And so I think a mentor could help at that point. A community group where you're mentored at will, you know, where you can ask your questions and someone can answer it is probably equal to getting a one-on-one mentorship. So you could do you could join a community where you get mentorship, or you can do one-on-one with someone. When the place I find is most useful though is when you hit those snags. You know, you should have someone you could say, let me see what this person can help, how this person can help me get over this hurdle. Sometimes the problem isn't even the problem you see, and a mentor can see that problem, see what the real issue is. A mentor can get you faster, further. You'll always reach your goal if you're working on them, but a mentor can help you reach those goals faster. So at any stage, a mentor is useful.
Yeah, completely agree. I think that's when you say about like just recording on your phone, that's a trap I think a lot of people fall into with all sorts of things. I know I've fallen into the trap of like thinking that you know what you need to know. I've done that myself with marketing. I kind of thought I knew what I was doing in terms of marketing, and then you get the mentor, and then when you discover what they know and they have to say, you realize that actually you didn't really know half of it at all.
Yeah. And it's really not about someone knowing more than you. It's about someone seeing what you're not seeing. You know, it's like the agonizing, gut-wrenching situation with what microphone to use, right? It has nothing to do with the microphone, right? And a mentor can point that out to you.
Yeah, it can kind of...
Well, let's talk about something else.
Sort of set you free from the... Yeah. And just closing out then, if there was one thing, like you've been sort of in this space in all sorts of to different degrees for about 10 years now, what is like one thing that you wish you'd have known when you got started, or when you started thinking about podcasting 10 years ago, that it would have made things a little bit easier for you?
The one thing is, I wish I had known it's my unique voice that matters. Everything else is noise. And I wish I had realized, I'd come to terms with the fact that it's the message that I'm serving to the audience that really matters.
Yeah. Perfect way to close things out. It's not, yeah, it's about your unique voice, and that though the ones the podcasts that know that seem to be the ones that do really well. So if anybody wants to hear more of Jen's insights, you can go onto Spotify or your favorite podcast platform. You can look up Tools of the Podcast Trade with Rosemary Francis, and yeah, there's a ton of content in there. There's nice bite-sized episodes. I just had a listen to the latest episode where Jen's speaking with a digital analytics and strategy about the role of analytics in podcast and business, because I know that's something that a lot of people have a bit of confusion over in terms of what analytics and stuff they should be focusing on. So I'd recommend having a listen to that. And you can go to toolsofthepodcast.com as well. Is there anywhere else you'd like to send anybody, or any way they can connect with you?
YouTube channel, Tools of the Podcast Trade with J. Rosemary. Yes.
Of course, on YouTube as well.
Yeah. And send me an email, message me on Instagram, Tools of the Podcast Trade podcast, and let me know if you have any questions. I'll answer them. No problem.
Awesome. Thanks. Appreciate your time. This has been really insightful, I'm sure, for a lot of the listeners.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to Podcasting Amplified. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. We'll be back next time with another conversation offering more insights to take your podcast to the next level and help you to achieve success. Happy podcasting.